Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this debriefing on what's happened in Japanese politics over the last several days. Joining me is Dan Harada with Nagatacho Forum. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning. Nice to be here again.
Today is October 3rd, and the Diet has been in session for 2 days. We have a new Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba. He's formed a cabinet and announced that just 2 days ago, and a Diet has been called an extraordinary Diet session. And I'd like to go into this with a little bit detail and getting some insights from Dan from his perspective as a member of the LDP of long standing. Can we see that first slide, please? So as you can see here, we've got the distribution of the Prime Minister, the cabinet posts that have been distributed, and the LDP positions that have been distributed. And through this, you can tell where the power structure lies within what was normally a calculation made by faction size, but with the disintegration of many factions during the Kishida administration, this is dissipated, and it's been revealed to us, this power distribution in the election that we just went through, this 12-day election, where there were 9 candidates and Mr. Ishiba came out on top. There were 3 main candidates. There was Mr. Koizumi, there was Ms. Takaichi, and Mr. Ishiba, who were the top candidates, and how those shook out and what the election results told us in the final hours was a bit of a shock to a lot of political observers. And going through this briefing today, we'll tell you about how that shook out and what it means in terms of distribution and political dynamics going forward. So in this particular slide here, you can see that there are 3 members of the upper house that are represented in this power distribution. There are 2 women in the cabinet. There are a continuation of posts for several influential people. For example, Mr. Hayashi was chief cabinet secretary under Mr. Kishida. He's generally considered to be the number 2 person in the Kishida former faction, and he's maintained his post. And there are a couple of other influential people that stayed in their position, but only 2 of them. But you've also got the reemergence of Mr. Suga, who was former prime minister, as you know, before Mr. Kishida. And the tensions between those 2 gentlemen has survived over the Kishida administration. And this is a kind of time for them to perhaps settle differences. I don't know if that's the right description. But if we can go into the next slide, and talks about the distribution of appointments among different factions, who won, who kind of stayed pretty much at par, and who lost. Dan, do you have any insight on this?
No, I think the big loser, if I can say that, is Mr. Aso, and the big winner is Mr. Suga. So they had the same lineup about half a year ago, but at that time, Aso-san was on top and Suga-san at the bottom. Tim?
One of the most powerful people in Japanese politics during the Kishida administration was Mr. Motegi, and he is on kind of the losing side. There were a couple of people that stayed the same, but I thought that the fact that Mr. Motegi has no political position in the current cabinet and the current distribution of the LDP choice positions is pretty revealing. Do you have any insight on that, Dan?
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, he came out very poorly in the election, and he was not rewarded. So I completely agree with you.
So one of the things that has transpired over the last 8 months is the disintegration of factions, and people who watch Japanese politics for a living have always been able to calibrate who's on first and who's on second based on faction strength. And faction strength is determined by how many members any political figure is able to attract into his faction. And those factions served a great purpose in terms of educating and keeping members coalesced together, and also voting on issues of importance to that political faction. And within those factions, there might be a cabinet minister or two, and how those decisions are made, the faction might have a bit of a sway in how decisions are being made. Now we don't have the factions. The only faction that is currently existing formally is the ASO faction with about 58 members, and political action groups, which are kind of policy research groups. And so the coalescing of people after the factions basically maintains some of the same consistency of membership. There is a little bit of fluidity, as we saw in the election of prime minister, or the second round for the candidates to become prime minister. But if you look at the Mr. Moriyama, for example, who had a very small faction, maybe 8 members in his faction, he was one of the first to disband, in fact, even though he was untainted, completely, totally exonerated from the kickback scandal. He was one of the first of the factions to disband, but he's come in roaring strong, Dan.
Yes, I mean, he was the first one that Prime Minister Kishida, Prime Minister Ishiba wanted to speak to become number 2 in the party, you know, a Secretary General. And both met, but Mr. Moriyama stated that he wanted to have an election as soon as possible, which was different from what Mr. Ishiba stated in the campaign. And Mr. Ishiba yielded to Mr. Moriyama. Tim?
Yes. So one of the pronouncements that Mr. Ishiba was pretty well known for making is he wanted to have if he became prime minister, and he said this during the campaign, he wanted to have an extended period where the opposition party and the LDP, whoever was prime minister, would be able to have an exchange of issues and discussions and forming opinions. And maybe there would be an election thereafter at some point in time, but maybe there wouldn't. And that is in opposition to what Mr. Koizumi said. Mr. Koizumi said, if I'm elected prime minister, I want to have the election for the lower house at the soonest possible date, right away. And he was criticized by Mr. Ishiba for making that statement, saying in somewhat collected terms, you know, why the rush? Why do you want to rush to judgment? Are you trying to hide something? And you should have an opportunity to air these differences, because people have a legitimate right to question who the prime minister is going to be. And when he became prime minister, on almost the same day that he became prime minister, he said, I want to have the election at the soonest possible date, which was the same date that was identified by Mr. Koizumi, Dan.
Yes, absolutely. It was a complete turnaround. And this turnaround was triggered by the position of Mr. Moriyama.
Right.
Yes.
So Mr. Moriyama now fills the role that Mr. Motegi filled as the Secretary General of the LDP, a very powerful position, probably maybe the second or the third most powerful position other than the Prime Minister. Wouldn't you say, Dan?
Absolutely correct.
Great. So let's move to the slide that describes the distribution of party posts and cabinet posts, and talk about or examine, can I have that slide, please? Examine those who supported Mr. Ishiba in the second round. There was a lot of jockeying. There was a lot of horse trading on that final day on the 27th, last Friday, a week ago from tomorrow, actually. And those people were rewarded with party posts or cabinet positions. And this chart describes that. Who's on top, who really came in strong, who they brought some votes with them to assure that Mr. Ishiba, rather than Ms. Sanai Takaichi, became prime minister. It was close. It was a very close race at the final call there, Dan.
Yes, it was very, very great. I think Mr. Asso played a critical role. He was backing her, and he completely fell out. And this explains why now the position which Mr. Asso had before the election has now been filled by Mr. Suga.
Yes, it's really interesting. It's not, we follow this pretty much all the time, Dan. This is our bread and butter. And even for us, it was quite a bit of a surprise. Of the 9 candidates, there are some people that ended up, even as a candidate opposed to the winning candidate, Mr. Ishiba, who came up with party posts. And in this chart on the bottom, it identifies 3 of those, Mr. Koizumi, Mr. Hayashi, and Mr. Katsunobu Kato, who came up with really good positions. Finance minister is probably the 3rd choicest position to be in. Anything that you can say about those candidates who have maintained some sort of a role in the current position, Dan?
Well, I think the most significant, the most visible is Mr. Koizumi. Now, Mr. Koizumi has been appointed in charge of the election which is around the corner, and he brings his stamina and so on. And I think he's in this particular appointment, a big winner.
I think he is too. I was a little bit surprised that he didn't receive a cabinet position, but actually when you think about it, to give him the election chairman position within the LDP, there are 4 chief positions within the LDP structure, and the election campaign is probably the 2nd or the 3rd. And to give that to Mr. Koizumi, who is very photogenic, he's very popular among the masses, I thought was a brilliant move. We're going immediately into an election, and to have him as the election chairman, I thought was a great decision by the Prime Minister.
I really have nothing to add to what you just said. I completely agree.
So one of the individuals who has been prominent in Japanese politics, the longest serving finance minister, the longest serving deputy prime minister, Mr. Taro Aso, came out a little bit on the short end of the stick. If we can see the next slide, please. And of the Taro Aso faction, there are some winners and not very many winners, but there are just a lot of people that are just holding a position there. Mr. Suzuki, who was the finance minister, is now moved over into a party position. So that's good news for Mr. Aso. But Mr. Aso, when the prime minister announced who his cabinet and who his leadership is going to be, Mr. Aso was not initially on that lineup, Dan.
He was not, definitely not, and that's a sort of blemish. And a few hours later, people, or Shiba-san, realized that he had made a mistake, and he promoted Mr. Aso to a honorific title, but at least it's theoretically number 2 now, which he was before. So that was a blunder. It has been corrected.
Yeah, you say it came to his attention that he maybe left Mr. Aso off the list. I think coming to his attention is a nice way of putting that people were pounding on the door and breaking down the barricades, because it happened in very close quarters and very quickly. The top position that Mr. Aso potentially wanted, which was taken by Mr. Suga, since it's already taken, what can you do? What other position can you give somebody of Mr. Aso's stature? Saiko Komon? How does that work out, Dan?
Exactly as you said. He is now supreme advisor, which theoretically is one notch above Mr. Suga.
Right.
So blunder has been to an extent corrected, and it's now history. And we move on to the new stage.
Right. And let's see how that works out. But there are also other people who have been in the game, played the game, lost the game. They're not prime minister. And what's happened to them, this chart at the bottom deals with those who are not necessarily in the new administration. Takaichi, Mr. Kobayashi, who really came on strong. He was the first individual to announce his candidacy for prime minister. And Mr. Motegi, we've talked a little bit about that. But I think Takaichi she was really close to becoming prime minister, just a dozen or so votes short of becoming prime minister. And at the last hour, that was snatched from her. And it seems like she has her nose a little bit out of shape. And Mr. Kobayashi came on really strong. He's only a 4-term member from Chiba, a former bureaucrat, but he really impressed a lot of people with his acumen and his political savvy. But those 3 individuals, and I'd like to focus just a little bit, if you don't mind, Dan, on the first 2, Kobayashi and Takaichi. Where are they in the mix, and what happened with them?
Well, in a way, I would like to say that they are, quote unquote, in the opposition. I mean, both of them were offered a job in the cabinet or in the party's lineup, and both of them turned it down. And in her case, it was almost expected. But in his case, it showed a strong determination, a strong willpower, and I think he's going to be around the top for many years to come.
Yeah, I agree. But also Takaichi as well. I mean, she is a strong contender. She is a smart cookie. She's very strong on economic policy. And I think she wanted to go a little bit toe-to-toe with the Bank of Japan. And also, there was a little bit of criticism about her stance with regard to China. And I think that detracted a little bit from her. But in any event, being offered, we don't know what they were offered, a cabinet role or a party position, to turn that down, that does 2 things. Number one, it tells people that there is great disdain that they feel to the current administration. And number 2, it tells you that there's going to be gadflies as this administration goes forward. Without a party position, you can say whatever you want to against the cabinet or against the prime minister and not be threatened by consequences.
Absolutely. I think that they made the right decision at the right time. And even if they are not in power now, I would certainly not rule them out.
No.
Neither of them.
Great. Thank you very much for that. So if we can go to the next slide, Dan. Everybody wanted to know, they've asked, I'm sorry?
Yes.
Yes, they've asked you endlessly. They've asked me in the weeks leading up to it, who are the kingmakers? Who is deciding this in the background? And for a while there, it was very opaque. We didn't know. And Mr. Kishida played a very clever back office role. He wasn't pronouncing much about how he felt about any of the candidates. He didn't endorse anybody verbally. He stepped pretty much out of the fray and was very quiet, but he came in very, very strong at the end. But I think among the kingmakers here, clearly there was Mr. Taro Aso, there's Mr. Kishida, and there's Mr. Suga. And what has arisen out of all of this is also Mr. Moriyama also came up as one of those kingmakers or a supplemental kingmaker. Do you have any insight onto that and how long that might last and what that portends for the political dynamics moving into the elections?
Well, Aso-san is already 84. One is not completely certain that he will be a candidate in the next election. But at some point, history will tell and longevity will also tell. And Aso-san will probably depart from the list of kingmakers.
Yeah.
I think you were completely right about your assessment of Kishida-san. He played his cards very smartly in this whole thing. And he is definitely going to be around as a kingmaker for a while to come. Tim?
Yeah, so a lot kind of relies on how the current administration fares. And we have so little time to evaluate and to determine, what's the strength of the structure that Mr. Ishiba has put together. And if we can go into the next slide, it talks about how little time we have. Today is the 3rd. the prime minister and the administration has decided that this extraordinary diet session will end on the 9th. And in this very brief period of time, from the 1st until the 9th, today's the 3rd, we're a third of the way through it, there will be an opportunity to question the prime minister, to have a little bit of tit-a-tat back and forth, maybe on the 7th and the 8th. And then on the 9th, it'll be the last day of the session. There will be an opportunity for the opposition parties, in particular Mr. Noda of the Constitutional Democratic Party, the new leader of that party, to question the prime minister in an open diet session. That's a really very brief period of time. He's going to be on the hot seat for 3 days running, Dan. And then at the end of that, he will close down, or the diet will close down, and they will take a bit of a break, maybe 4 days, and then go into the election period. But can you just walk us through a little bit about the Q&A period, the time that he needs to spend describing his policies, and the opportunity for the opposition to hold his feet to the fire and ask him really hard questions?
Well, we start with the 4th, which is Friday tomorrow. In both houses, Mr. Ishiba will explain his overall policies. That will cover practically anything from foreign diplomacy to whatever you want. And he will speak alone. Nobody will question him. Then we move into next week, and the first 2 days of next week, the leader of each opposition party will ask questions to the prime minister, and the prime minister will have to answer. But it's question and answer, and that's it, no debate. And then on the 9th, on the last day, then there will be an open debate between the leaders of the opposition parties and the prime minister, following which the prime minister will dissolve the House. Tim?
So depending on how the prime minister performs and the strength of the questions posed to him, they close down the House, and then the vast number of people who are voting for lower house members base their decisions kind of on that performance, but also they're basing their decisions on how they continue to feel about the kickback scandal, about the Unification Church, the issues that were buried or that were glossed over or that pushed aside. And they finally have the opportunity. I mean, Mr. Kishida said, for all extents and purposes, I have punished those people who should be punished. The other people have been received their own retribution. They stay in the party. They're still good LDP members. And let's let bygones be bygones. Let's move forward. This was Mr. Kishida maybe 6 months ago elucidating that. But the voters never had an opportunity to say, hey, wait a minute. You took money, you didn't pay taxes, you hid it, and you got away kind of scot-free, and you're supposed to be a politician. They didn't have that opportunity. They'll have that opportunity when the election campaign starts on the 15th and runs until the 27th, a 12-day election period, Dan.
On the 28th, the Monday after the election, the kickback problem would have been settled. The voters would have spoken, and end of it. Tim?
Right. So the prime minister will be able to say, the voters have spoken. It is part of history now. Let's move forward. And if we can go to the next slide, it's not the next slide that I wanted to talk about, but let's go to the next slide. In the question and answer period that the prime minister is going to be dealing with, this is a list of the hot button issues that he needs to confront in order to get through this tough 3-day period, close down the House. He will go to Laos on Saturday for the ASEAN. He'll be there for 2 days. He'll come back, and the election campaign starts almost immediately. So there's very little time. These are the issues, Dan, that he must confront, not the least of which is the relationship between Komeito and the LDP. but also what to do about the Abe members who have been tarnished or blemished with some sort of involvement with either the kickback scandal or the Unification Church that have been somewhat unresolved. Is the LDP under the current administration, under Prime Minister Ishiba, going to endorse them in this election campaign? How strongly are they going to support them so that the LDP ends up with more members after the election than it started with? Dan?
Well, I have some doubts about the LDP ending up with more members after the election than before. But in any event, the party and Kisan will decide shortly, tomorrow, after tomorrow, whom of the quote-unquote tainted LDP members would be endorsed by the party or would be let drifting alone by themselves. So that's a decision that is coming very soon, and at least during this session of Parliament, and obviously before the election starts. Tim?
And I guess how Mr. Ishiba deals with it, the LDP will be judged by his decision. So if he endorses all members of the LDP equally so that they can run successfully and the LDP can at least maintain parity, the voters will decide that that was fair or unfair. They didn't get an opportunity to actually evaluate it. And like we said, 2 or 3 times already, there's such a limited period of time where the prime minister can tell people, this is what I stand for. This is what the administration is going to do. If you have some hard questions, I'll take them. And based on my response, in 3 days or 4 days, you'll have an opportunity to have all of the members of the LDP and all of the members of the lower house run for re-election. You can quiz them in your own election campaigns and decide for yourself. And at the end of the day, we'll end up with how many members end up being revoted or voted in from the LDP. Dan?
Yes, but the long and the short again is that the scandal and the kickbacks and all that after the election will be history. The voters will have spoken. So that's it. 28th is the final of that unpleasant event.
Yes. So what you're saying is actually it's kind of a double-edged sword. Part of what you're saying is at the end of the day, the voters will decide, the LDP will regroup, and they will move forward in control of the government in coalition with Komeito. The opposite could be true too, that the LDP does not do very well, that it ends up with far fewer members than it started with. It needs to regroup with Komeito and maybe consider joining forces with one of the parties who are currently in opposition.
I think what you're saying is going a little too far to imagine a scenario where Jiminto, LDP, and Komeito together do not have a majority. That's very, very difficult for me to consider.
Okay.
So, Tim, your idea of having somebody from the opposition joining, that is, I think, a little too far.
Let's take a look at the next slide, Dan. This is the distribution in the upper house and in the lower house on how many members belong to each political faction. And on the left-hand side, the total seats that are held by the LDP, the green dots there, it's beyond 50%. And with Komeito in pink, it's almost it's not quite a super majority. It's what 200 and I can't read the number, 298 of 465. So together they sway. They have all the chief cabinet posts. They have all of the committee posts. They can basically run through the political issues, the bills that are going through the Diet. coming back from the election, should that dynamic, and we both suspect that that dynamic will change somewhat, but what you're saying is it's too many people to lose, even if the voters punish the Abe faction for what they perceive to be their faults, and they elect somebody else. So that means Komeito could increase their number of voters, or maybe one of the opposition parties, Ishin, or the Constitutional Democratic Party, or one of the other opposition parties could increase in strength. It might upset the dynamic that the LDP now currently holds. You have any insight on that, Dan?
Yes. No, I just repeat what I said a few minutes ago. It for me, it is it's very difficult to imagine that Jiminto, LDP, plus Komeito loses the majority. That's very difficult for me to believe.
What is the spread there, Dan? The number of LDP members that need to be maintained in order for the LDP plus Komeito to at least maintain 50% of the lower house. Is it 60 people?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And just so that we don't gloss over it too much, on the right-hand side is the upper house. The upper house has an election every 3 years. 50% of the upper house goes for election. The election for 50% of these members is in probably the summer of 2025, maybe September, in fact. But the distribution and the numbers are very different there. The LDP has a better hold on institutional power in the upper house than they do in the lower house. But for a bill to become law, it has to be initiated in one of these houses and passed by the other house before it becomes law. And that's why the LDP having a Komeito coalition is so important, so that they can pass these laws, even while giving the opposition party a time to chew over the details or to come up with different ideas, but not to ram everything down their throat. That happens from time to time. And also some bills, when they are raised in one house and go to the other house, become law by automatic application of the law. But in most instances, the bill needs to pass both houses. Any final comments on that component, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, the election to the upper house, as you just pointed out, is at least more than half a year away. And the election to the upper house will, to a certain extent, have been affected by the election which we have in front of us to the lower house on the 27th. So I think I see what you're trying to say, but I think it's a little looking too far ahead to have a firm judgment about it.
Right. And just as a final observation, we're only 3 days into this administration. Dan, I know you're frequently asked, what is the stability like? What is the long-term view of this administration? Can you give us any insight? It's a little early to make any kind of prediction, but moving into an election with the LDP currently in a kind of a fractious situation, you've got a couple of people who are inside the LDP, but they're kind of against the current administration, Ms. Takaichi, Mr. Kobayashi, Mr. Motegi potentially, and trying to form a unified front and showing flowers and faces and kissing babies for the population so that they vote for the LDP. It looks like it's going to be really fractious. We've got the election of the U.S. president on November 5th. There's a lot going on, and a lot could happen. It could be a rather short administration too. We just don't know. It's too early to call.
Well, it could be a very short administration. I completely agree with you. I think, and I'm a devoted LDP party card-carrying member, but I think we are going to lose some seats. There's no question about that. How will inside the party, that lot of seats, how will it translate into the relationship with our new leader, Ishiba-san? That's too early to say. But I
Okay.
would not rule it out.
Yeah. So the election will be on the 27th of this month. And then on the 28th, everybody will be happy they won, they lost, the decisions have been made. But the Diet still needs to come into session to welcome and to acknowledge these new members. It's not going to be the day after the election. That hasn't been decided, but there, before the end of the year, there will be another supplemental budget perhaps, but the Diet needs to coalesce once again. The emperor needs to cross the bridge one more time, open the Diet. It will be a brief period because this will already be in November when this happens. So November and December, a very short period of time. The Diet is required constitutionally to open their 150-day session in January. So it will be very, very active over these next 6 or 8 weeks, Dan.
It will be indeed. And I hope that we'll have several other opportunities to talk about it and discuss what the whole situation is.
Absolutely. So it's a very fluid situation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dan, for participating and guiding the discussion here. If you enjoy this sort of thing, please continue to be involved. Connect with Dan Harada on LinkedIn. Join his breakfast briefings, which are once a month. We just had one this morning, in fact. Or listen to the political briefings I host every Sunday morning. But there's so much dynamic change that's going on now, even from day to day. On the handouts, on the slides that we had, in fact, we put a disclaimer that these details and this assessment is only accurate as of yesterday when we finally printed these out. But everything is changing day to day, and it's really an active situation. Dan, any final comments?
No, I completely agree. Let's stay tuned and see it one day at a time.
Great. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for tuning in. Please continue to stay engaged. See you in the next briefing.
Thank you. Goodbye. Well, we did it.